Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to my talk on Beyond Drama, multi-perspectival approaches to narrative and story. It's a great pleasure to be delivering this keynote as it's a topic that's very close to my heart and that I've been thinking about throughout my career and that I believe to be particularly important in these somewhat unprecedented times. So I'm going to share my screen, but the images are kind of there just as backdrop really. So I reckon you could easily walk around and listen to this. You don't have to be sat staring at a computer screen if that will free you up to walk and think as I'm talking. So here we go. Right, there's my screen and there's the slideshow. Okay, so that is the title. And I want to say that given that narratives and stories do so much to shape the way we experience and understand the world, I want to advocate for the necessity in taking a good hard look at the way we tell stories, both to ourselves and to others. And I think this is particularly urgent in the face of the existential threats of climate, pandemic and war, and that a transformational approach is necessary. As part of this, we need to consider what sort of histories we need in order to help us to build the capacity to create more sustainable futures. So with this in mind, I want to start with this person, Olga Tokarczuk, who said in her 2018 speech for the Nobel Prize for Literature that we lack ready narratives, not only for the future, but even for a concrete now, for the ultra rapid transformations of today's world. So I think that's a really good quote for us to galvanize around, the question being, what form should these narratives and stories that we need to develop take? So on the one hand, it's important to decenter the sites of production for narrative, offering alternatives to the dominant centers such as Hollywood in film, Meta and Google in the online space, and to decenter structures of power that frame who gets told what and by whom. But on the other hand, I think it's also important not to just decenter the sites of production, but to also look at the narrative structures and devices that we use to tell stories and to consider the full range of possibilities that are at hand. This involves looking at the interplay between the platforms and technologies that we use to tell these stories. And that goes all the way from books through to VR. And also we need to consider more traditional forms of storytelling that don't use media. And we need to look at the imaginative frames of mind that we bring to these technologies. So focusing on the imagination, what sort of narratives should we be creating? Should we be reaching as many people as quickly as possible with tried and tested narratives and structures? Or should we be looking to create these more transformative narratives that can perhaps help to reframe the way we think about and even experience things, such as our engagement with the non-human? What role can different narrative approaches and different platforms play in this process? Are there set structures for narrative and story which transcend time and space, or does this vary across different cultures? And is our understanding of narrative and story evolving across space and time, or are there universal continuities which transcend all of this? Obviously, these are big and important questions which have been asked before, but which I strongly believe we now need to keep asking on an ongoing basis so that we don't become complacent with our narratives and our storytelling at a time when we need all the resources we can garner to navigate our way through the challenges that lie ahead. So in this talk, I'm going to start a bit by talking about myself to help position my own approach to all this. Then I'll look at my work with the Royal Anthropological Institute's biannual film festival around decentering the sites of production for narrative as a lead into some thoughts on whether there are universal narratives and stories that transcend cultural difference. I'll end by focusing in on my own work with interactive documentary. This is an edited book that I've got with my iDocs colleagues on the development of transformative narratives, which might help to change our mindset towards building more collaborative approaches to narrative and story. Collaborative is key, which are not based on hero's journey tropes of the individual making it through against all expectations. I will ask how we can actively work on the mindset that we bring to our storytelling platforms, thus helping to make narrative and story a more diverse and actively evolving process. So here I am in Bristol, speaking to you from my spare room in this very lovely city, where I work in the film department at the University of the West of England. I haven't always lived here, as I grew up in Leicester, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the UK. And I've lived in a couple of other cities as an adult too. So thinking of Leicester, I was born there and my parents were still in the same house until relatively recently. This had a big influence on the way in which I think about narrative and story. I grew up in a largely white suburb of the city, which over time has become a much more mixed community, populated by many families of Gujarati Indian descent. This change began in my teenage years, and the local schools that I went to now have a large majority of Asian British pupils. Growing up in this environment had a strong influence on me, and I think it certainly contributed to drawing me to study anthropology, starting with my BA dissertation at university. I wanted to do what I could to educate myself out of the racism that I was surrounded by at school, and I have to say, to some extent, at home as well. A lot of this came out of ignorance and lack of understanding. So through my career, multiculturalism has always been a strong interest and passion of mine, and I now found myself chairing the Royal Anthropological Institute's film committee, with an active involvement in helping to decolonise the discipline and convene the Institute's biannual film festival, which is held here in Bristol. So with this in mind, and to bring things back to the topic of multiperspectival approaches to narrative and story, I want to spend a bit of time talking about a public-facing event that we held for the opening night of the 2019 RAI Film Festival. So this is an image from the event. It was an opening night screening of, as you can see, Edge of the Knife, or as said in the Haida language, Sugwe Kuna, which I hope I've pronounced that correctly. This is a Canadian 2018 drama film that was co-directed by two members of the Haida Nation. It's the first feature film on the endangered Haida language, which is spoken in the Haida Gwaii archipelago off the coast of Canada and on the Prince of Wales Island in Alaska. The screenplay was written with input from Haida residents with an aim to preserve and teach an endangered language, of which there were only about 20 speakers left at the time of making the film. Fluent elders carefully translated the scripts into 3 Haida dialects and trained the cast, none of whom at the time who could hold a conversation in Haida. And they were trained in memorizing, pronouncing and expressing their lines. The film had, a decent budget of around $1.5 million. And the support given for the film by the Canadian government was to help promote reconciliation for the residential school system, which, as we know, strictly prohibited Indigenous students, including Haida, from learning their native language. The primary audience is the population of Haida Gwaii. It was first shown there, and then it was shown at the Toronto International Film Festival. It's been internationally feted, and the idea is that the film can be used to teach the Haida language as part of a month-long training module. And one of the actors in the film, who was 73 years old at the time, has talked publicly about finding herself speaking Haida for the first time since being a teenager. She's commented on several occasions about how it was fantastic to be able to speak the language again without being afraid. So the film is a historical tale based on Haida oral storytelling and mythology. It's set in a seasonal fishing camp, and it centers on the relationship between the nobleman Aditsi and his best friend, Kwa. Now, Aditsi causes the accidental death of Kwa's son, and he flees into the rainforest, descending into madness and transforming into a supernatural being crazed by hunger. When the families return in the spring, they discover that Aditsi has survived. Can he be rescued? And can he be returned to his humanity? Meanwhile, Kwa also wrestles with his own deepest desire, which is revenge. Now, it's a traditional Haida narrative that follows someone who survives an accident at sea and whose humanity declines as they struggle to survive. And of course, the story also works as an allegory for any struggle, mental or physical. But what I want to talk about is the fact that the film adopted a pretty conventional dramatic structure of the hideout wild man. At the screening for the RAI Film Festival, my initial reaction to it was that it was a Hollywood-style dramatization of an Indigenous community story and that it was exploitative. This came up in the Q&A at the end, and it was clear that it was an issue that was dividing the audience. Quite a few other people were upset about this too. However, one of the actors from the film was at the event, and I was able to speak with him afterwards. I asked him if the narrative structure felt exploitative to him. He said that it didn't, as it mapped well onto that particular story. He did, however, also say that there are many other stories within Haida culture that could not have been mapped so well onto this particular dramatical structure. And it was a collaboration, with established filmmakers working across with the Indigenous directors. But this point about there being many stories within Haida culture that this dramatic structure wouldn't have worked for has stayed with me ever since. And it relates to discussions I've had over many years with filmmaking colleagues. And for me, it's not about rejecting dramatic structure and the hero's journey, but about putting it into a mixed economy of approaches to storytelling and narrative. What I find frustrating is that many filmmakers seem to be so steeped in a set approach to narrative and story, which is linked to this 3-act structure, whatever dramatic curve, and to the idea of transformation with inciting action and resolution. And they can't see beyond it. They kind of say, this is human nature. This is what defines us as a kind of fundamental aspect of humanity. Speaking as an anthropologist, I think this is a big problem and something that we really do need to address, not only to destabilize the cultural hegemony of the good old hero's journey, which we see here, but also to think through how we might tell less anthropocentric stories, not instead of, but alongside the more familiar structures. Now, this brings me to Donna Haraway, who's argued that it is essential at a time of ecological crisis that we do tell less anthropocentric stories, and that we need to decenter the human to create a more multi-species approach to our storytelling. This needs to be one that is not so much based on conflict and individualism as on collaboration and collective problem solving. So rather than escaping into fantasy, or perhaps alongside escaping into fantasy, we need to, in her words, stay with the trouble, because it's not going to go away and there are no easy answers. This will involve making kin, not only with our own kind, but with the non-human as well, as a necessary and urgent act. Now, Haraway has been influenced by the novelist Ursula Le Guin, who wrote an essay in 1986 called The Carrier Bag of Fiction. That's the film that Haraway made called Storytelling for Earthly Survival, where the ideas I've just mentioned come through. So onto the carrier bag theory of fiction. This is a good article that kind of summarizes what it's about, and saying we should all be reading more Ursula Le Guin. Her novels imagine other worlds, but her theory of fiction can help us better live in this one. So it's about having things alongside a mixed economy of storytelling. So in essence, in this essay, Ursula Le Guin proposes the idea that the spear was not the earliest human tool. Instead, she says it was actually the receptacle. Questioning the spear's phallic, murderous logic, she instead tells the story of the carrier bag, the sling, the shell, or the gourd. She explains the logic of this by pointing out the idea of the spear coming before the vessel doesn't actually make sense. And she says this is because 65 to 80% of what human beings ate in Paleolithic, Neolithic, and prehistoric times was gathered. Only in the extreme Arctic was meat the main staple food, hunter-gatherer culture. So her carrier bag theory is not only plausible, but it also does meaningful ideological work by shifting the way we look at humanity's foundations from a narrative of conflict and domination to one of gathering, holding, and sharing. Obviously, both of these should be in dialogue. Unlike the spear, which follows a linear trajectory towards its target, And unlike the linear way that we've come to think of time and history in the West, the carrier bag is a container for a big jumbled mess of stuff. So this way of looking at the world departs from the idea of history as a long line of victories. As well as its meandering narrative, a carrier bag story also contains no heroes. There are instead many different protagonists with equal importance to the plot. This is clearly a very different way to tell a story, fictional or otherwise. The carrier bag story has no heroes. It's a collective rather than an individualist endeavor. There's no lone genius, but rather people rooted in a shared existence. As said above, the literary world seems to have embraced this more strongly than the film and television world, with experimental film all too often being seen as esoteric and only of interest to artists. So what does this say about our contemporary media, dominated by stories of linear, mutually attacking males, occasionally flipping the coin by affording these qualities to a woman or to someone outside of the heteronormative narrative? Shouldn't we be questioning this and considering whether it's acceptable that much of the burden of building human civilization goes largely unnarrated, because there's no arc to it and it's regarded as being undramatic? However, I would argue that in spite of this argument, things are becoming more conservative on this front, not less, and that certainly in the documentary storytelling world, which I know most about, this push towards the 3-5-act dramatic structure by the gatekeepers is becoming more prevalent, not less. I want to point you towards this special issue of the online journal of world records called Beyond Story, which contains articles from filmmakers who've been commissioned in recent years to make short films and have found the whole process extremely frustrating. To quote one filmmaker who's included in the collection, Isabel Carbonell, "I tend towards durational filming, often about relationships between people and the land, or the interconnections between species, or about the history of a particular site. I am as much interested in communities and landscapes and animals and microbes and ecosystems, not just in individuals and their heroic journeys. Having gatekeepers tell me over and over again to change my approach to fit the extremely narrow and limiting formula of a film centering around a human being on some kind of quest or undergoing some monumental life change full of conflict has deeply affected my way of thinking about the way to make films." As I said, the literary world seems to be more open-minded about such issues than the world of film and television. Olga Tokarczuk, for example, has won the Nobel Prize for Literature for her postmodern novels, and the ongoing popularity of short stories from the likes of Raymond Carver says it all. The standard response to this by filmmakers is that film is time-based and that a dramatic arc is necessary in order for audiences to be entertained. I would argue, however, that this limited, albeit valid, but limited view of the possibilities is what has been pushed onto audiences by vested interests, and that this is what audiences have come to expect because it is what they have been told to expect. It's a vicious circle, in my view, that's pumping out a certain way of seeing that, yes, it's found in all cultures, but it's by no means the only form of storytelling that needs to be challenged and opened up. In the words of David Byrne, who spoke this in his film American Utopia, "I need to change, you need to change, we all need to change, everyone is welcome in my house." This is quite a political statement to be saying in contemporary America. What I found in my undergraduate teaching is that there is an interest and openness to alternative ways of thinking about narrative and story. It's just a matter of lifting the lid off the box and giving the students permission to think differently. So this slide is what students see when they come onto our campus at UWE. Yet I do worry that we're all too often letting them down by not doing enough to open up their imaginations and to give them permission to explore new ideas and possibilities. This is partly just to do with the increase in student numbers we're all experiencing on film courses. I've been teaching experimental film for several years now, and my students often say, "This is so interesting. I'd never thought about film in this way before. If I could make money doing this, I would definitely take this approach." I find this interesting and wonder where this will settle in the relation to the type of work that our students produce in the future. Will the industry evolve to accommodate a broader range of approaches, or will it be business as usual? And what about audiences? Will they be agents for change, or will they be happy with endless dramatic narratives, such as seen on channels like Netflix? I think it's our duty to navigate the admittedly tricky path of teaching our students and the people that we employ skills that will get them jobs, whilst at the same time entering into a dialogue with them about the future. At the very least, we need to place dramatic narrative structures within a wider context and to make our students aware of other approaches as well, so that they can create stories that are not always anthropocentric and or based on ideas of conflict. Now, this is the anthropologist Levi-Strauss, who had very influential thinking about deep and surface structures, which hasn't exactly helped in terms of a societal obsession with dramatic narrative. In his structural analysis of myth, he proposed there's a universal reality in the unconscious regularity of the human mind that is demonstrated in the parallel structures of myth across cultures and across time. He came up with the idea of surface and deep structures, whereby the surface structure is the cultural approach to the narrative, and the deep structure is the more fundamental explanation of that narrative. Understanding the deep structures, he said, permits us to understand the surface structures which different cultures place on these myths. So framed like this, a narrative becomes a surface structure, a way of presenting or understanding a situation or a series of events that promotes a particular point of view or set of values. Underneath this is the deeper structure of the concept itself, which Levi-Strauss said transcends culture through the universality of myth. Levi-Strauss put binary oppositions at the heart of myth, in particular, the binary opposition of nature and culture. He said that when the binaries are identified, we can then find their solution or mediation, which is a coming to see that dichotomies only operate in conjunction. Thus, they can only exist in relation to each other. In cross-cultural terms, the anthropologist Evans Pritchard, here he is, said that it was the anthropologist's job to translate one culture for another, to make the strange seem familiar and to get beyond the surface structure of culture to the deep structure of humanity. I have to say that this idea of translating culture informed my understanding of anthropology for a good while, even though I was confronted as an 18-year-old doing voluntary work in East Java with black and white magic and all sorts of cultural tropes that felt very alien and frankly quite disturbing at times. On the other hand, I had an experience while doing fieldwork in a remote Himalayan village, which was so different to my own experiences in the UK, yet at the same time felt very familiar. A moment of revelation came, in particular, when I found myself in an apple orchard just by the river, by the stream, high up in the mountains, lying in the long grass in a meadow, and channeling my experience of orchards and meadows as a child. I felt a really deep connection in that moment, which was really quite profound. So I'm not saying that there's nothing to these ideas of deep and surface structures, that they can't be found across cultures and across time. However, what I'm saying is that we shouldn't privilege these deep structures and commonalities over all other ways of thinking about society, culture, narrative, and story. Which leads me to a bit of anthropological theory, the ontological turn. This came from research in the Amazon, which suggests that there's not necessarily one deep structure or world that unites us all. Instead, there's multiple worlds or cosmologies, and we'd be mindful to consider this when thinking about narrative and story. Rather than just looking at multiple points of view, at surface structures which reflect a common deep structure, the ontological turn proposes that worlds themselves and not just worldviews may vary. I don't have time to go into detail here, but here's some additional concepts for those who want to follow them up. The crisis of representation, the ontological turn, recursive analysis, reading diffractively, and finally, designing for the pluriverse. What the concept of the pluriverse is pointing to is the idea that culture and nature and other such binaries, including the separation of mind and body, or indeed the human and the non-human, can be separated out, is a very specific way of looking at things which is by no means universally applicable. Instead of looking at truth, for example, as a noun, these concepts ask for it to be considered as a verb, as something which shifts through a constant process of becoming. This takes in other ways of being that are not based on binaries and which recognize that worlds and not only worldviews may vary. This blows the hero's journey concept out of the water as a universalizing principle for narrative and story. That said, I really don't think it completely invalidates it, as there are instances where it can work, as with the example I gave from Edge of the Knife. But again, if this is all we have, then it's a real problem, because it does indeed become a monolith that stifles other equally, perhaps even more important in today's world, approaches. So within anthropology, there's a real effort going on to decolonize the discipline. And at the heart of this is a genuine attempt to decolonize the stories that we tell ourselves about the discipline and about how we can study difference without essentializing it. Key to this is breaking down binaries between core concepts such as nature and culture, between binaries between privileging the eye over the ear in engagement with fieldwork, and between considering alterity as somehow different from the norm. To make this concrete, I want to briefly refer to an online conversation that happened recently between the American artist and technologist, Amelia Winger-Bearskin, and the American media theorist, Jean Youngblood, which is available on YouTube through the San Francisco Gray Area channel, that's spelled Gray. So Amelia Winger-Bearskin is of Iroquois Indian descent. She makes this important point that the word being in human being means something different within indigenous Iroquois culture from Jean Youngblood's white settler, albeit 60s progressive culture. In Iroquois culture, the being in human being is an active verb, whereas in the white settler culture of science and rationality, it is seen as a noun. The former suggests that humans are constantly in flux and opens up a porosity or continuity between the human and the non-human, whereas the latter is a more fixed way of looking at humanity, at our inner essence or core personality, if you like, which separates us out from the non-human. Suffice it to say that these two ways of looking at the human can open up very different approaches to narrative and story, both of which can have their place, in my view, but which need to be held in dialogue through a mixed economy approach to the types of narrative that we construct and stories that we tell. The key to this is to embrace complexity, to stay curious and not to be afraid of that which we haven't previously encountered. Easier said than done, I know, but I think that this is an attitude and approach that we need to keep working at, probably as an ongoing lifetime endeavor, in order to avoid entrenching into what in today's world so easily become nationalistic and perhaps even authoritarian narratives of control. Authoritarianism is a very real danger, in my view, given the way things are currently playing out, and assuming that we are opposed to such developments. I think we all need to do our bit to resist this. With this in mind, I want to return to my students and to our responsibility as gatekeepers, both those of us who are teaching and those of us who are employing. So Colin Young, the founding director of the National Film and Television School, died last November, and a colleague on the RAI Film Committee reminded me the other day of one of his favourite phrases: filmmakers should be missionaries for a better way of life. Putting the word missionaries onto one side, several of my colleagues on the film committee were trained by Colin, and they report that he did indeed work on an open curriculum, an opportunity to learn through practice rather than be taught any predetermined approach to the craft of filmmaking. Although he was a strong advocate for the principles of observational and Jean Roust style shared filmmaking, he did indeed stress to his pupils that we must all find our own styles when making a film. Given all that I've said above, it seems very important and is something that we as gatekeepers need to bear in mind. Whilst the auteur approach is perhaps being replaced by more collaborative approaches, and the industry pushes that as well, it does seem important above all to listen to our students and or to the young people that we employ. We need, in my view, to enter into a dialogue with them rather than say, this is how it's always been done, this is what you need to do to get a job, because after all, the industry is in flux too, and change seems inevitable in in the current situation of climate and all the rest of it. So this flux is not just due to cultural changes, demands coming from a renewed interest in indigenous cultures, as well as the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movements, for example, but it's also coming, I would argue, from technological changes. One only has to look at platforms like YouTube to see that narrative and story are playing out in ways that are different from what we see in the cinema or on television. For starters, I would say that the narratives on platforms like YouTube are more relational and that clips work in relation to each other, not necessarily in linear sequence. YouTube playlists enable ideas to be broken down into a series of shorter films which build on each other, not necessarily in a linear way, making some bigger than its parts. These are some of the playlists from my former PhD supervisor's channel, which has just under 50,000 subscribers from literally all over the world. This provides a much wider reach than his books, his view being that over time, his YouTube channel will come to be what really matters in terms of getting his ideas out to a wider audience beyond the academy. This is, in my view, very forward-looking of him. YouTuber fans can spend hours moving from one video and indeed one playlist to another. I would strongly suggest that they don't need a dramatic narrative arc to keep them engaged, as there's something else about the mediality of the platform and their intrinsic interest or curiosity in the content, as well as in the way you navigate around, that is keeping them engaged. I think this isn't just superficial, and that YouTube is a place where evolving approaches to moving image literacy are perhaps developing. How this will play out over time and in relation to other platforms is anyone's guess, but it's definitely worth noting, not least because it flies in the face of dramatic narrative theory. And as I've said before, it's not about replacing one with the other, but it's more about creating a mixed economy in which different approaches can flourish and the spirit of diversity can be upheld. So I just want to end by referring to my own project on polyphonic documentary. This is the website where you can read about it, polyphonicdocumentary.com. I'm collaborating with a colleague called Stefano Odorico, who's in Leeds. And what we're doing with this project is working collectively with members of the interactive documentary community who've signed up to join our polyphonic documentary community on the social media platform Discord. We're exploring together interactive documentary methods and practices through a series of collective reading sessions and small-scale projects. These small-scale projects are exploratory and are designed to increase our understanding and awareness of possibilities, as well as our literacy with the tools. We're working with the core idea of polyphony to see what evolving platforms and tools can bring to the already established debates about multiperspectivity within the documentary field, also bringing the ontological turn and ideas about the pluriverse into these debates. In particular, we're looking at what kinds of narrative and storytelling these tools and platforms can afford. This is within the context of the need to create approaches that are fit for purpose in the light of climate emergency and increasing ideological polarization. So this is our launch. There were more people, but that was one of the screens. And we were able to do it online. So we've completed the first stage of a collaboration in which we asked members of the community to submit 3 to 5 short videos shot on their mobile phones, so done quickly and easily, on what polyphony means to them. So by doing this launch on Zoom, it opened up participation to contributors from many different countries, including India, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, Portugal, Malta, Germany, the UK, Canada, and the USA. We've collated these videos into 2 separate projects using one tool called Korsakov, which has been around for quite a while in the iDocs world, and another new kid on the block tool called Stornoway, which is a more commercial product at the moment that's doing very well as the WordPress of interactive storytelling, it's called. The developers of the tool, these 2 tools, are part of this community, and they've offered them up for free for the project. They're also powerful tools for the exploration of different approaches to narrative and story. So this is the entry screen, and this is the interface for the Korsakov piece, which is quite abstract and exploratory. So they are all video clips, and you can move around and you can just select whatever you want to watch in a very abstract, exploratory way. And you don't necessarily get what that image shows. It surprises you. And we've organized the clips by place. So when a clip comes up to watch, it tells you what place from the contributor that's from. And then we did the same thing. So here, this is when you're looking at a clip, and then it offers you, related clips. So it's very abstract and exploratory, but there you can see the place. And then the other version in Stornoway has a more structured approach to it. So you can divide things into chapters, and it's each time you look at it, you're going to get the same clips in the same order, but you do get choice about which chapter you look at. And then when you're in a chapter, you then get choice about which clips you want to look at. So that's chapter 1. That contains clips from Germany, from the UK, from Portugal, and from Turkey. And then that's chapter 2, which takes you to India, Germany, Australia, and New Zealand. And so the clips are organized sequentially in chapters. So our next step is to meet with the contributors to discuss the results and open it up to them to remix through a Creative Commons license. We'll also collectively come up with a new project, and will not necessarily confine ourselves to Korsakoff and Stornoway. Given the mix of contributors from across many countries, this is a decolonizing practice in which we're seeking to challenge our own cultural assumptions to find ways forward that are fit for purpose across different contexts. In so doing, we are aiming to decolonize IDOC's methods and practices, to defetishize the technology, and to see what we can learn from doing these projects together that we can then apply back into our own practices and projects. So in this sense, the audience for the projects that we're making together is primarily ourselves as a learning process to better understand the potential of IDOC's methods and practices for potentially creating transformational and relational approaches to narrative and story. That said, we've published the initial results, making them available for wider consumption. So please feel free to take a look and let me know what you think. So that's our contact details, but you can see through the blog, part 1 and part 2 of our collaboration. That's where the links to look at these projects are online. I'm interested to know if any of this resonates beyond the group itself, and if anyone knows of any similar projects. So if you're interested in IDOCs, interactive documentary, and keen to join the community on Discord, please let us know via these contact details on the website. So that's polyphonicdocumentary.com. I should stress that this is a largely unfunded project at the current time, so it proceeds in a somewhat erratic way, but we've recently received a small amount from the Screen Industries Growth Network in Yorkshire to progress this work in the coming year. So please watch this space. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you were able to move around a bit while I was talking, and I look forward to discussions that come from this, and I will be working with these ideas, for many years to come. Thank you very much. So I will stop sharing and I will stop recording.